Support your local PBS station.
January 20, 1900. The skies above Oahu were black with smoke. Bubonic plague had been discovered in Honolulu's Chinatown, and panicked health officials were doing everything they could to try to stop the spread.
In those days, they didn't really understand how plague was transmitted. So the public health approach was isolate people. They would wall off a whole area with police and checkpoints and wouldn't let anybody in or out. But if they couldn't stop the problem, they would often do targeted burnings of buildings. Their point of view is, we don't care what you do. If you have to burn the place down, just make sure that you contain this epidemic.
Desperate residents fled their burning homes as the fire spiraled out of control. And mobs of white residents stood by with clubs and revolvers, threatening to kill any Asian who tried to skirt the exit lane out of the quarantine zone.
This is the Black Plague of the Middle Ages that wiped out 1/3 of the population in Europe. So we have this sense, if it wasn't stopped, the consequences would be unbearable.
The fires burned for 17 days and left nearly all of Chinatown in ashes. 4,500 of its residents were homeless. The most feared disease in history, bubonic plague, was an unsolved mystery. It had decimated the populations of Europe and North Africa in 2 separate pandemics over hundreds of years. And the third was now raging across Asia.
This is the start of the steamship era, so now disease and people and goods can travel around the world incredibly quickly. And the bubonic plague spreads along Hong Kong, spreads
the consequences would be unbearable.
The fires burned for 17 days and left nearly all of Chinatown in ashes. 4,500 of its residents were homeless. The most feared disease in history, bubonic plague was an unsolved mystery. It had decimated the populations of Europe and North Africa in two separate pandemics over hundreds of years. And the third was now raging across Asia.
This is the start of the steamship era, so now disease and people and goods can travel around the world incredibly quickly. And the bubonic plague spreads along Hong Kong. It spreads to Japan, it spreads to India, and millions of people start dying. At that time, there was still a medieval sense of what this disease was and how it was spread. Many people thought it was miasma, bad air, or it was simply a disease of filth. Other people thought that this is only a disease of rice eaters.
Racism and ignorance were already in the air as the bubonic plague made its silent way across the Pacific. It would arrive in North America for the first time in history, where it would spark nationwide terror, denial, and blame. Two men would try to stop it, struggling with not only the scientific unknowns, but unanticipated forces of politics, commerce, and race. June 28, 1899. In the cold morning fog, a lone Italian crab fisherman made an unsettling discovery. Two bodies were floating face down in San Francisco Bay. The previous morning, the Japanese steamship, the Nippon Maru, had arrived in San Francisco from Hong Kong, stopping at Shanghai, Yokohama, and then Honolulu. Ominously, she flew a yellow flag, the international signal indicating disease.
When the Nippon Maru entered San Francisco Bay, two stowaways, who evidently were ill, jumped overboard into the bay waters. And when their bodies were recovered, the local doctors found them to be suspicious.
Unnerved by both their autopsy findings and recent reports of plague in Asia, the city doctors immediately sent their results to Joseph Kenyon, the nation's foremost plague authority, and the newly appointed head of the Marine Hospital Service on nearby Angel Island.
Angel Island in San Francisco Bay had a quarantine station where cargoes and passengers were checked for all kinds of disease by the doctors of the Marine Hospital Service.
The Marine Hospital Service had been established 30 years earlier to treat sick seamen. But the idea of public health had since evolved into a matter of national concern. The MHS was now charged with fighting the spread of epidemics, using federal powers of quarantine and surveillance.
Their main responsibility was protecting the people of the United States from the spread of disease around the world. So there were Marine Hospital Service officers stationed in Rome, in London, in Asia.
Just weeks into his posting, Kenyon knew better than anyone that hospitals around the world were reporting 90% death rates from the plague, and that millions had already perished from a pandemic that had been raging since the 1850s. Although no one knew why, rats and filth had long been associated with plague. Kenyon ordered the Nippon Maru to be disinfected and checked for vermin before having all 55 passengers quarantined on Angel Island. Then he faced the most critical step of all, determining how the men had died.
Kenyon suspected plague, and there was a little rattle in the papers. Well, Kenyon thought the bodies were too far gone. There wasn't definitive proof. So the press kind of backed away, Kenyon backed away, everybody backed away.
The positive diagnosis would be calamitous, but the condition of the tissue samples and decomposed bodies made forensic confirmation impossible. Without scientific proof, Kenyon could not assert that plague had arrived. Yet his years of rigorous training had taught him to remain alert.
Joseph Kenyon was a star. He was beautifully educated. He had studied with the best scientists in the world to learn the state-of-the-art methods of diagnosing infectious diseases. Then, at the age of 27, while he was at the hygienic laboratory in New York, he diagnosed the first case of cholera with the new bacteriologic tests in the Western Hemisphere. He was truly the elite of American scientists.
But Kenyon's meteoric rise was interrupted by personal tragedy.
Joe and Elizabeth Kenyon's daughter died of diphtheria at the age of 3. It's a terrible disease to die from, and it must be devastating for a parent.
Diphtheria at the time was one of the most devastating childhood diseases. So Kenyon goes to Germany to work with Robert Koch, who had discovered these cures for diphtheria. And he can't believe his own eyes. Seeing these kids recover as if by magic, and he can't help but believe that he's seen his own daughter's face on all of these children, and that really gives him this idea that medicine can conquer anything.
Kenyon was fueled by not just a new sense of purpose, but of possibility.
Joseph James Kenyon, he was a very unique guy from the day he set foot in the Marine Hospital Service. He was fascinated by technology. He taught himself photography and radiology, which was a new technique around the turn of the century. He was an inventor, and he invented an enormous number of machines and devices to steam sterilize, for example, or chemically sterilize. Any new technique, he was just in love with it and he wanted to master it. He was an early adapter of ideas.
The 39-year-old scientist had already proven himself a leader in the fledgling fields of microbiology and infectious diseases. Once in D.C., Kenyon developed the hygienic laboratory into a national state-of-the-art research center, which supported the MHS by identifying diseases and controlling epidemic outbreaks.
Dr. Joseph Kenyon loved the National Hygienic Lab. He and his young family loved the finer East Coast living and the cream of scientific society in Washington, D.C. However, Walter Wyman, the Surgeon General of the Marine Hospital Service, his eye was on the West Coast, where he feared plague would be entering, and he transferred the young Joseph Kinyoun to San Francisco to run the Angel Island quarantine station. And of course, Kinyoun was not pleased about being dispatched to what he thought was this frontier outpost.
The MHS quarantine station on Angel Island, in the middle of San Francisco Bay, was a jumble of filthy and neglected buildings. Kinyoun now had to contend with a workplace that was completely unsuitable to the urgent task at hand: protecting the nation from a deadly epidemic.
The Marine Hospital Service was a uniform branch of the United States government, and Kinyoun himself, he was a very military guy. He always followed orders, and he did what he was told and didn't complain about it. He was clearly the best man for the job. He probably knew that. So, as everything else, he threw himself into it 100%.
From the moment Kinyoun assumed his post in California, he had been on high alert for plague. San Francisco was not only the busiest port on the West Coast, but connected by rail to the rest of the country. It was terrifyingly well placed to spread disease far and wide. To miss even a single diagnosis could be cataclysmic.
Joseph Kinyoun is really intent on checking every ship from Asia. Because after bubonic plague emerges in Honolulu and is discovered in the Chinese border, it becomes kind of a confirmation bias. It was only going to affect Chinese people, that one could contain it in some way, and that set up a terrible dynamic. It only percolated more fear, more confusion, more misunderstanding. And all eyes were targeted on a Chinese source.
As the 20th century dawned, everyone celebrated. And no place had more optimistic swagger than San Francisco. It was home to 1 out of every 4 people who lived west of the Rockies. A third of the nation's money west of the Mississippi flowed through her banks. The city was a trading hub, the portal to the east, and the diamond in the crown of a state already rich with natural resources. It truly was the city of the future.
As a gold rush boomtown, San Francisco had new money. It had 3 opera houses, railroad and mining tycoons living in palaces on Nob Hill, and a new cable car system. San Francisco in 1900 aspired to be the Paris of the Pacific Coast.
Nearly 6% of the city's population lived in a 12-block district.
Chinatown is home, and it always will be. My mother was born in the year 1900 in San Francisco's Chinatown, and she lived in Chinatown throughout her entire life because they didn't have any choices. They were not permitted to move outside of the neighborhood. Things were redlined, there was discrimination, and people were very stereotyped.
Chinatowns primarily exist because Chinese weren't allowed to live in white neighborhoods or any other neighborhood. They are what sociologists call ethnic enclaves, where people like to live with people who speak their language or eat similar foods or practice the same religion. But they're also confining. So Chinatowns are a combination of ethnic solidarity and discrimination and exclusion.
As the year of the rat dawned on January 31st, 1900, shop owners in Chinatown began noticing a disturbing sight. Rat carcasses littered the district's alleys and courtyards. And for 41-year-old Wong Chuk-king, something was definitely wrong. A worker in a nearby lumberyard, Wong lived in the Globe Hotel on DuPont Avenue, the main artery of Chinatown.
He shared one bed with two other men. They'd take turns sleeping. It was really a meager existence of survival. He, like many people who came from China, expected their time in San Francisco to be short-lived. They come, they make a lot of money, then they go back home a wealthy man. That didn't play out for almost all of them.
For several weeks, Wong Chuk-king struggled with mounting fever, exhaustion, and painfully swollen lymph nodes, or buboes. Because city hospitals were close to the Chinese, he sought traditional Chinese remedies, but nothing seemed to help. Eventually, he was too sick to move.
His roommates, they see that he's dying. They take him to a local, what was called a Hall of Tranquility.
The Chinese have a holistic view. They believe that when they die, the spirit needs to be tended to, and the remains had to be brought back because of their view that the ancestors played a great role in the afterlife.
One of the sources of mistrust between the community and Western doctors was a very different view of life and death. The body should not be cut. Autopsies were anathema. One's soul had to return to one's home village, so Chinese were very careful.
So it was a quiet affair, and Wong Chuk-king died alone on March 6th, 1900.
State law required a physician to issue a death certificate, so a health inspector was summoned to examine the body.
He notices a bubo in Wong Chuk-king's groin, and he jumps back because he does know what this is. He knows it's a sign of bubonic plague. So he figures that I'm going to take a sample of this tissue from Wong Chuk-king's body, and I'm going to run it over to Kenyu at Angel Island. And I'm going to let him make the decision of whether this is plague or not.
Kenyon knew all about buboes, where the word bubonic comes from. The swollen lymph nodes were an infamous sign of the plague. Yet he also knew that they weren't enough for a diagnosis, and he had to be 100% certain.
To prove a plague death scientifically, you couldn't just do it by examining the live patient or the cadaver. You had to isolate the organism from tissue.
In 1900, Microbiology was still a fledgling field, and the idea that germs could cause disease was not fully accepted, even by many doctors. Kenyon's superior, Surgeon General Walter Wyman, had himself published a paper on the plague that was full of speculations and misinformation. That the disease was spread by dust, tainted food, and contaminated objects. Wyman also endorsed racial theories of the time, that the disease targeted Asians while sparing whites.
Surgeon General Wyman himself said it was only a disease of rice eaters. If you ate a quote-unquote muscular diet of meat, you were somehow immune to it.
Such ignorance was widespread, due in part to the fact that scientific confirmation could take years. Nevertheless, European scientists had recently identified the bubonic plague bacteria using a test called Gram stain.
Bubonic plague is transmitted by bacteria called Yersinia pestis. And Gram stains are used under the microscope to enhance the difference in colors so you can see the bacteria in what we call a smear on a slide. And Yersinia pestis stains pink.
As the first American to have studied the bacilli, Kenyon was unquestionably the most qualified scientist in the country to test for plague. Hours after Wong's death, he undertook the exacting forensic work, using the sample taken from the body.
Isolate the germ in biopsy, test it with the Gram stain. Put it under a microscope and look for the distinctive pink rod-shaped bacilli with rounded tips. And that was the classic signature of plague.
Yet the presence of the telltale marker alone wasn't enough to confirm a diagnosis. Kenyon would have to grow the culture in his lab, which would take time. And there was none to spare. For he couldn't help but wonder how many others might be infected. Across San Francisco Bay, the City Board of Health was too spooked to wait. To them, it was clearly a Chinese problem, confined to Chinatown. So they decided to control matters by quarantining the entire district. One day after Wong Chut-king's death, the Chinese community awoke to find ropes cordoning off their 12-block district. Overnight, 20,000 people, nearly all of the city's Asians, found themselves virtual prisoners.
What was unusual was that it didn't apply to this one particular house where the man was found, but applied to the whole Chinese quarter, sealing off a whole area of a city.
There was this kind of idea that the Chinese carry a particular virulent form of some kind of disease, whether it was smallpox or syphilis or bubonic plague, and that the disease is endemic to their bodies. That it would be possible to infect innocent middle-class white people.
There was definitely this view that Asians were more susceptible to the disease, as opposed to whites. And this was a widely shared view at the time.
The residents of Chinatown were really stuck. They weren't allowed to be citizens. They weren't allowed to own property. They weren't allowed many fundamental rights.
In 1900, anti-Chinese sentiment wasn't isolated. it was codified by federal law. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 prohibited all Chinese from citizenship, essentially relegating them to the margins of society.
The Chinese were already not seen as human before the Chinese Exclusion Act, which is why the act passed. The only time in our history that we specifically named an ethnicity to say they can't come to the United States, they don't belong. They're too different than us.
The building of the Transcontinental Railroad required tons of hard labor, which Chinese workers had taken on. Once that final golden spike was driven, the welcome mat was withdrawn. And the once essential Chinese workers were regarded as a surplus that would cut into demand for white labor. So the white labor movement was very hostile.
Almost 20 years have gone by since the Exclusion Act, and this has been a very tumultuous number of decades where the government tries to take this right away, impose that discriminatory law to try to drive people away.
The Chinese community saw the cordon for what it was: the latest unjust action taken against them, based on flimsy evidence and a convenient excuse.
The populace was violently opposed to being sealed inside Chinatown. Many people worked outside the district. They had jobs to get to. And interestingly, the white community, while not so sympathetic to the viewpoint of the people in Chinatown, wanted their cooks and gardeners and domestic back on the job. And so all sides were at war. And by March 10th, the ropes came down.
So the first quarantine of Chinatown, it didn't last very long, only 3 days.
Because the quarantine came down so quickly, many people in San Francisco thought it was just all a sham. It almost eroded public trust immediately.
In the face of such apparent incompetence, the city's response was one of relief and amused contempt.
One of the papers celebrated the end of the first quarantine by writing a silly poem. Sweet Fong is at his post once more, and cooking reigns supreme. Because the people had gotten their domestic servants back. It was that kind of racial supremacy emanating from every corner of the city.
Alone in his lab on Angel Island, Kenyon had managed to successfully grow the microorganism within 48 hours. But the next step, injecting it into a healthy animal to see what would happen, would take days. Once again, Kenyon took extra precautions, choosing to inoculate not one, but 4 lab animals. 2 guinea pigs, a rat, and a monkey.
3 of the animals died pretty quickly. The last one, the monkey, was the one he was hoping on. If it didn't die, then maybe it's not the plague. Well, it died.
On March 13, 7 days after Wong Chut-king passed away, Kenyon was finally able to confirm the cause of death. Wong became the first diagnosed case of bubonic plague in the United States. But Kenyon feared he would not be the last.
Kenyon immediately sends a coded telegram to DC. Bumpkin confirmed. And that was the code word that plague is here.
Kenyon's boss, Walter Wyman, had every reason to believe that if it got out of San Francisco, it would go over the whole country, and countless deaths would occur. So the people in Washington were just alarmed, and their point of view is, we don't care what you do. If you have to burn the place down, just make sure that you contain this epidemic. It's a national emergency.
As federal officials frantically tried to coordinate a response, word of Kenyon's diagnosis spread quickly among San Francisco's leaders. Yet powerful merchants and politicians, like Mayor James Phelan, refused to accept his findings.
Shipping exchanges around the world was very, very important source of income. So if there was plague in San Francisco, it would be blocked, would no longer be open. So industries were at stake.
Mayor Phelan was very concerned that if word got around that San Francisco had cases of plague, that the city's commerce would be dealt a really serious blow.
City leaders were used to autonomy and didn't like being told what to do, especially by authorities at the federal level.
With the Marine Hospital Service, the federal government, they were now centrally becoming involved in public health across the United States. And they felt they had supreme authority. But the city government, the merchant elite, was saying to them, we have jurisdiction in San Francisco. And then there were state officials and the governor who thought, well, we have authority over all of California.
And there becomes a question immediately of who has authority if there is an outbreak. Is this a federal responsibility, or is this the city, or is it the state?
Most San Franciscans didn't care. They couldn't be bothered with the death of a faceless stranger in Chinatown, especially given widespread beliefs that whites were immune. As for city leaders, while they refused to accept Kenyon's diagnosis, they did agree that what they called the Chinese problem needed to be contained.
They didn't really understand how the bubonic plague was transmitted to people, but they knew if it occurred in a city, it would be in one area. And so the public health approach was to find the focus and go in there and do whatever you could to get rid of the disease.
The moment Mayor Phelan declared, Asiatic infections are a constant menace to San Francisco's public health, 75 health inspectors and dozens of policemen, armed with sledgehammers and axes, descended on an unsuspecting Chinatown. They smashed down doors, ransacked homes, stole brazenly, and beat anyone who stood up to them.
They were subjected to plague measures, which included torching of belongings. They would bring in smudge pots of sulfur and fumigate a building. If you were a merchant selling fine silks or ceramics, it would spoil your goods. So these measures, which were crude and discriminatory and not very effective, frightened the populace. People were not eager to report a case of sickness in their home.
In 1900, at the time of the bubonic plague, my great-grandfather had a business called the Pacific Fruit Packing Company, and my family lived above the cannery on Stockton Street in Chinatown. They went to church where Ng Poon Chu was the assistant pastor, and that's how, when he started a newspaper, my great-grandfather helped him fund the Zhongsai Yat Po. And in Chinatown, they would post some of the newspapers on the walls. So the Chinese knew exactly what was going on.
Ng Poon Chu and his newspaper documented what the deeply felt fears and concerns were of Chinese laborers, how they distrusted Western medical authority, how they feared what was going to happen to them from a Chinese perspective.
Alas, why should Chinatown's good name depend on the life and death of a monkey? We don't know whether they are rooting for Chinatown or the monkey. 中社一報 Daily.
Nine days after Wong Chuk King's death, Kenyon confirmed 3 more cases, all within Chinatown. Kenyon had feared such an outbreak all along, knowing that even a handful of cases could explode exponentially into a national epidemic within weeks. The urgency of the situation caught the eye of newspaper magnate William Randolph Hearst. On March 18th, his paper, the New York Journal, published a special national edition trumpeting the sensational story from California. Pressured by commercial stakeholders, San Francisco's leaders quickly responded, enlisting the editors of leading newspapers to dismiss what they now called rumors.
City Hall and all of San Francisco's elite, they had the same idea in mind. We're not going to report any news of the plague. You have the Chronicle saying, we're going to write editorials saying that Kenyon or anybody else from the Marine Hospital Service is just trying to pick San Francisco's pocket.
Dr. Joseph Kenyon was a proud man. He regarded the tools of science, the enlightenment of his technology, as a gift. And he expected, quite rightly, some deference and respect for what he brought to the city. And he got none of it. Because from the moment that Joseph Kenyon diagnosed plague in the glands of Wong Chuk King, science was on trial.
And the bubonic plague was called Kenyon's fake.
As the media storm swirled around him, a frantic Kenyon tried to retrace the last days of each victim's life in a desperate attempt to determine who or where the next might be.
What made Kenyon so terrified when he started identifying the disease was he found one victim and he could not find any connections to the next victim. It was almost like you're looking at the ocean and you can't see it, but you know something is down there, and he had no idea what it was.
It was a mystery. There was a kind of creeping pace. There would be a case or two, and then it would pause. Kenyon tried to puzzle it out.
He was looking for other cases of plague. He also knew that because of the way Chinatown was being treated by local officials, they might hide cases.
Suspicions everywhere, and every shadow becomes an enemy. 中社一報 Daily.
A plague death would require autopsy to confirm the case. It was an offense in the culture, so no one was eager to call in the scientists.
And it becomes a cat and mouse game. And people keep on questioning him. If the plague is as scary as you're saying it is, there should be bodies everywhere. We should also see living victims who are struggling with this.
People thought, well, if the plague exists, it should be spreading like wildfire. Why aren't hundreds of people infected with it? And it obviously made things difficult for Kenyon, because in the face of pretty clear evidence, people denied that the plague existed at all.
When 3 more people died in mid-May, Kenyon telegrammed Wyman urging a bold and unprecedented plan. He proposed vaccinating every Chinatown resident with the recently developed half-kind vaccine. In 1900, vaccination was still a frightening concept to most. But in Chinatown, the proposal was further complicated by the dark racial dynamics of the time.
There had been a long history of white people, European-descended people, treating the Chinese in San Francisco badly. So the rational expectation was, you know, if the white power structure wants this done, there's got to be something wrong with it.
The Chinese relationship with city health authorities, there was nothing positive about it. There was a history of malignant neglect. Chinese were routinely refused treatment at city hospitals. It was only that year that a Chinese clinic was allowed to open in Chinatown called the Donghua Dispensary. So Chinese had absolutely no trust in city health authorities. Also, they weren't vaccinating white people, so it seemed to be targeted at them.
The half-kind was largely untested. Existing data showed only a 50% protection rate. Furthermore, the drug's purported side effects were so notorious that a headline-hungry reporter from a Hearst newspaper volunteered to be injected himself.
Within 2 hours, the serum had spread through my system, and its effects began to be felt. Shooting pains extended through the chest, down the arm, and even into my neck and head. My left arm felt numb. The pain in my shoulder, chest, neck, and arm was quite severe.
Out of thousands of Chinese living in San Francisco, only 53 were willing to be vaccinated. Growing desperate, Kenyon telegrammed Wyman.
Regard situation very serious. Will require almost superhuman efforts to control now. So much time has been lost.
And that's when the Marine Hospital Service had to make its first authoritative stand against plague.
Surgeon General Wyman telegraphs Kenyon immediately saying, "You are our man in San Francisco. It all depends on you. You know, you have to protect us all."
Now charged with overseeing the entire West Coast, Kenyon quickly hired additional officers, whom he dispatched across California and Oregon to beef up inspection and patrols. He also made vaccination mandatory and took exclusive aim at not just the Chinese, but Japanese with an unheard-of travel ban.
On May the 18th, the Board of Health of San Francisco passes a resolution to order the transport companies to refuse transportation to Chinese and Japanese without the certificate that said that the person had been inoculated with this half-kinds vaccine. And it's quite clear that they have endorsed the recommendations that have been passed on to them by Kenyon. So now the Chinese and Japanese are being told, do it or you're confined to San Francisco. You won't be able to leave. It was being pushed on them coercively.
The doctors are about to compel our Chinese people to be inoculated. Tomorrow, all business houses, large or small, must be closed and wait until this unjust action is settled. 中社一報 Daily.
It's back to the wall. A defiant Chinatown turned to its own leaders. A consortium of district associations called the Chinese Six Companies.
The leaders of the 6 companies were the biggest merchants in Chinatown, the most influential members of their associations. Any dispute with the city government or the state government, Chinese would send their representatives to negotiate or to protest.
The Chinese leaders met with Kenyon at the consulate and implored him to call off his plans. When he refused, the Chinese felt they had no option left but to take to the streets. From the most powerful merchant to the lowliest worker, all of Chinatown took immediate action to protest Kenyon's orders.
There were riots. 1,000 Chinese protesters descended on Portsmouth Square in Chinatown, where federal doctors had set up tents to vaccinate people. And they pulled cobblestones out of the streets and threw them in shop windows, pitching furniture into the street. They stood up to him and they said, "We're not standing for these measures."
It was so terrible that 100 police had to protect Kenyon because the San Francisco mobs would have killed him.
The Chinese in San Francisco are beleaguered, but they also have fought every inch of the way with legal cases that are brought by the leadership of the community, the merchant leaders, sometimes together with the Chinese consul. They sued the government over everything.
Chinatown rose up as one to fight the travel ban. Within days of the mandate, a class action suit was filed, naming Kenyon and the San Francisco Board of Health.
A businessman named Wong Wai sued. He went to court, and he charged that Dr. Kenyon and everyone involved had violated the rights of the Chinese.
It was a petition for an injunction to stop the health authorities from preventing people from leaving the city. It was racially discriminatory, and that was forbidden by the 14th Amendment, which says no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the law. The Chinese were not eligible to become citizens, but they had secured for themselves recognition as constitutional persons. And as such, they came under the protection of the 14th Amendment.
What you end up having for the court case is the question. Is this a kind of unfair use of the law that targets one group racially unfairly?
The judge agreed with the Chinese, and he said, "I see no proof that you've offered that this is a disease more likely to be contracted by or transmitted by Chinese people." He said this travel ban had been illegally applied with an evil eye and an uneven hand, focused on racial theories of disease transmission, completely unscientific.
In addition, the judge issued a restraining order against Kenyon and advised him and the MHS in no uncertain terms to back off. Stung by the emphatic ruling, Kenyon wired his fears to Wyman.
Believe situation to United States very grave. The decision practically nullifies all acts of federal government. Most serious blow service has received.
Unwavering in his convictions, Kenyon ignored the judge and continued to enforce the known scientific measures of isolation and sanitation. He pushed for camps on Angel Island, as well as remote Mission Rock, to detain people even suspected of having the plague.
There were now threats to remove people forcibly from Chinatown. And at the head of it all was Dr. Kenyon, so he was called the Wolf Doctor. He acquired this nickname for what was perceived as a snappy and officious manner, aggressive, an assault on people, kind of adding insult to injury.
The wolf doctor is baring his claws and teeth. Enforced relocation to an icy remote island renders us without wings to fly. 中社一報 Daily.
The city and the health authorities were never really interested in ameliorating the conditions in Chinatown. What they wanted to do was isolate the Chinese community, protect white people, and that was their goal. So there's very little space to gain people's trust because the whole thing is rotten.
And now, other states were starting to put commercial pressure on California as well. Everything erupted in an acrimonious 3-day meeting, with Kenyon weighing in forcefully.
The state of Texas was preventing people and products from San Francisco from entering Texas. So the state Board of Health was putting tremendous pressure on the local Board of Health and says, what you need to do is quarantine Chinatown.
On May 28th, Kenyon privately exulted when the state health board secured what he had long thought was the best option: a full lockdown of all of Chinatown, indefinitely. Within hours, 159 policemen descended on the district, working in 3 around-the-clock shifts.
They start putting barbed wire around the quarter. They start putting a wall up around Chinatown. It becomes very clear to the Chinese that this is not like the first quarantine. The Chinese were very, very upset immediately as soon as the quarantine was declared.
Once again, nearly 20,000 people were locked down. They had no idea when they would be allowed out, or whether the authorities might even attempt to burn down the district like Honolulu only months before. With no streetcar service or incoming shipments of food and other vital supplies, panic quickly spread.
It was very draconian for the Chinese. So you had this complicated interaction between city, state, and the federal government. But it was almost a consensus that among all of them, that somehow the heart of the problem was the Chinese. And if we could just control the Chinese, we could control this plague.
People had that sense of doubt. Is this the way in which the health officials who never cared about our well-being want to eradicate us?
Once more, the Chinese turned to the most powerful tool they had.
They file suit again, and this leads to the second case, Ju Ho versus Williamson. And again, Kenyon was a named defendant.
A grocer on Stockton Street, Ju Ho noticed that the quarantine lines were not drawn in a straight line around all businesses in the region, that they zigged and zagged to exclude white merchants, and was specifically designed not to protect the health of an entire district, but to isolate the Chinese.
The quarantine line was along Stockton Street, so the cannery was in quarantine, and the white workers, women and girls employed by Lo Heng in the cannery and were allowed to come and go, but not the Chinese.
The judge says it's very clear that Caucasians on the perimeter are being treated differently. And it has to do with whether this is a reasonable exercise of the police power. And again, the court says no, it isn't, because the Chinese are not being protected at all. They're not being prevented from intermingling with each other. the individuals who had contact with these people who died of the plague have not been quarantined. So if the idea is to prevent the spread of a contagious disease, isn't this an unreasonable way to do it?
A day after the ruling, Kenyon imposed a sweeping travel ban on all Californians, regardless of race. This meant no one could leave the state without a health certificate from him.
And of course, that made him a menace to the entire city and the whole state of California. Dr. Kenyon was the top-down officer. He led by issuing sound scientific diagnoses. That plays very well in the lab and not so well on the street.
3 days later, on June 19, 1900, Kenyon was dealt a stunning rebuke. President William McKinley was forced to apologize to enraged state legislators for the actions of his federal officer and swiftly revoked the travel ban. Desperate to do the right thing, Kenyon had played his biggest card and lost. But the situation only worsened. Until now, there had been 13 confirmed plague deaths, all Chinese. From the beginning, racial pseudoscience had lulled many into the complacency of ignorance. What's more, the disease came and went in mysterious and inexplicable waves. Kenyon feared that the plague was spreading in darkness. This was confirmed in mid-August, when the first known white victim, William Murphy, fell ill and died. A worker who routinely made deliveries to Chinatown, he was succeeded that fall by another non-Chinese victim, a nurse at the Children's Hospital who had never been to the district. Panicked that the disease had begun to spread beyond Chinatown, Kenyon put all his men on high alert. Late that September, a steamship called the Coptic arrived from Hawaii and docked at Angel Island. An overzealous health official ordered that all passengers, rich and poor, male and female alike, be strip-searched en masse and examined for buboes in the armpits and groin. First-class passengers were outraged and vowed to never again sail into San Francisco as long as Kenyon was in charge.
And now everyone is out for blood.
The state senate in California say that Kenyon should be hung for what he's doing.
He had been decried by the politicians, by the press. The legislators want him to leave, lobbying the federal government for his transfer out of the city. By now, Dr. Kenyon had been smacked down in the courts. He was defending his hypothesis, his diagnosis, his standing in the Marine Hospital Service. So he is literally a man under fire, besieged.
It appears to me that commercial interests of San Francisco are more dear to the inhabitants than the preservation of human life. I am at war with everybody out here. Joseph Kenyon.
California's Governor Gage spun a fantastic conspiracy theory. He said that Dr. Kenyon and the federal doctors had actually created a fake plague by injecting corpses with plague bacteria that they had secretly imported, that it was all made up. And he planted the seed of doubt in people's mind. This was too much for Dr. Kenyon, and in despair and anger, he wired his boss, Surgeon General Walter Wyman, and said, "Please defend me from this slander against myself and the Marine Hospital Service.
But Wyman chose to remain silent. Kenyon was left defenseless and utterly alone. In despair, he wrote to a colleague.
My exoneration rests upon Dr. Wyman openly avowing his responsibility for my official actions. This he should, if he possesses the courage of a man. All these years, I have stood loyally by his side, keeping his political head from rolling into the basket.
It took a lot of stamina and guts to stay the course that what he believed in, because he knew it, where everybody else doubted him.
Barely 9 months since his first forensic diagnosis, Kenyon confirmed the 22nd known plague casualty. Seeking vindication, he now demanded a thorough, outside investigation into the truth of the matter. Meanwhile, word of San Francisco's troubles continued to spread across the country.
It became obvious to everybody in the country that San Francisco had an epidemic and they weren't admitting to it. The federal government and the state government of California were at a standoff. So a deal was cut that there would be a neutral federal commission. 3 of the most prominent bacteriologists in the United States would go west to investigate and find out whether there really was a plague epidemic and whether Kenyon was doing the right things or the wrong things.
Kenyon was looking for that sense of validation. He felt like he was 2,000 miles away from anybody he could consider his peer who he trusted. You know, finally, here are people who care about science, who care about medicine. And now I'm going to be validated, and we're going to save, thousands, if not millions of lives.
When the 3-man commission arrived in San Francisco in late January 1901, they felt the full urgency of their mission. Sensing they had to penetrate Chinatown, they immediately hired a local translator and go-between, a former 6 Company secretary named Wang Chung.
He was the link between medical establishment, San Francisco's establishment, the Chinese 6 companies, and Chinatown itself.
The move paid off. With the help of Wang Chung, and with Kenyon safely on Angel Island, the commission was quickly able to gain what had been missing for months. Not just trust, but access. Within weeks, they confirmed 6 new cases. When Governor Henry Gage learned of the commission's upcoming report, he panicked. He hastily made a trip to Washington, D.C., accompanied by a hand-picked army of the most powerful men in California: senators, newspaper editors, and business leaders.
When he arrived in Washington, he visited Surgeon General Walter Wyman and he proposed a quid pro quo. He said, "We will clean up the city of San Francisco if you keep the existence of plague secret from the nation."
Both sides had much to gain. California needed the White House to put an end to the matter that was threatening to take down its economy and reputation. And McKinley needed the vote-rich state to ensure his upcoming bid for re-election. All of the men now agreed. One hand would wash the other.
And this unholy deal was undertaken in the office of the President of the United States, President McKinley, in concert with senior Republican leaders, including those from California.
And they struck a deal with the Surgeon General to maintain what Dr. Walter Wyman, Surgeon General, called a perfect seal of silence They would hush it up.
On March 6, 1901, exactly 1 year since Wong Chuk-king's death, a local headline blared an unexpected and scandalous scoop.
Reporters broke news of this infamous pact signed by the Surgeon General and the Governor of California. And word got out about this cover-up.
Wyman found himself in an uncomfortable position. Yet he also knew that much of the vitriol aimed at the MHS had been greatly exacerbated by Kinyon's actions. His perceived lack of diplomacy was all anyone could talk about.
Kinyon had to be thrown under the bus. And so he was removed from his job without any real explanation for why.
In May 1901, Kinyon was ordered, without thanks, fanfare, or even notice, to pack up his family and relocate to Detroit. He had spent 2 long years trying to protect the country, and seemingly all in vain.
It was such a devastating blow because it basically ended his scientific career in many ways. He did not get to go back to his beloved lab, and I think that was devastating.
And I think he believed he had spent his life doing really good things, and he was very proud of that. And I think to be thrown under the bus was probably devastating to him, because it called into question the goodness of all those things he'd been doing for so long.
Dr. Kinyon did the hard work of nailing the scientific diagnosis. He just couldn't make it stick in the minds of the populace. And he was hurt, he was indignant. And being somewhat hot-tempered, he didn't go quietly. He blasted the city, he blasted Chinatown, blasted all the authorities.
Kinyon had come to San Francisco, expecting to champion science and save the country. Instead, he had been sent away in ignominy, while the danger still remained. With Kinyon gone, California turned to happier business. As their part of the secret deal brokered months before, state politicians welcomed President McKinley to a lavish, all-expenses-paid junket. Meanwhile, Wyman was on the hunt for a new quarantine officer. But after Kinyon's humiliating ouster, no one in the MHS community wanted what they saw as an impossible job. He finally settled on a candidate, Rupert Lee Blue, a 32-year-old physician from the MHS. Unlike Kinyon, Blue wasn't a research scientist. He lacked Kinyon's medical pedigree and rigorous training. In fact, he wasn't Wyman's first or even second choice.
Rupert Lee Blue, or Pert as he was known by his nickname, was round-faced and shy. He was diffident, and he really loved boxing matches. Not just as a spectator, but also as an amateur participant. He was preceded by rumors that he was lazy, as one of his colleagues called him, inert Pert.
He was known as kind of affable guy, not necessarily the most accomplished. And other people thought of him as, somebody who is barely getting by. But it's hard to be that critical of somebody you like, or somebody who's friendly.
The sixth of 8 children, Blue was born 3 years after the end of the Civil War to a struggling but respected family in Marion, South Carolina.
Blue came from nothing, essentially, and grew up in the fields. He'd walk with his siblings, bursting open watermelons with his fist and eating right there in the field. He knew he was not the most favored son. His older brother, Victor, was a war hero, and the parents idolized Victor. Rupert Blue kind of felt that if Victor's purpose in life is to harm, perhaps my purpose in life is to heal. So he went into medicine and went to one of the first public medical schools in the US. He wrote letters to his mom saying, "I don't think I can hack it. I can barely survive." And he barely graduated medical school.
Blue joined the Commission Corps of the Marine Hospital Service. The MHS represented adventure with a purpose. The chance to see a world bigger than that of his small-town boyhood, and to confront diseases he had only read about in school. As a quarantine officer, he tracked yellow fever in Galveston, monitored infectious diseases in Milwaukee, and investigated possible plague cases in Rome.
He had to work hard. Having lost his father to illness, he had to send money to his widowed mother and to his teenage sisters at home.
So he was working in the Marine Hospital Service and also taking all these other side jobs as editor of a medical bulletin or a newsletter just to try to bring in more money.
The new posting in San Francisco, commercial hub for the nation and Asia, was a huge step up from monitoring shipping fleets on Lake Michigan. It was a high-profile chance for Blue to prove himself, although it came with seemingly insurmountable obstacles. Chinatown feared and distrusted the MHS and its agents. City leaders were openly vying for their own interests. State officials still refused to acknowledge that the disease even existed. By June 1901, there had been a total of 34 official plague deaths. So Blue knew he had no time to lose.
The first thing he did, he moved into the city and he set up a lab right on Merchant Street, which is Chinatown. And he was comfortable there.
He would literally just walk into shops and start talking to people and trying to make those kind of friendships and forge those social bonds. And Kenyon, when he went into Chinatown, he had to have a protection of armed officers. Blue, he would walk down the streets by himself.
Blue also kept on Wang Chung, the interpreter who had assisted the Federal Commission. And since he knew that Chinatown's dead seemed to mysteriously vanish, he talked Surgeon General Wyman into an unusual expense.
He arranged for a horse and buggy to have his own, essentially, morgue service, so he could find bodies and he could inspect them as quickly as he could. Blue also paid the Chinese translators the same as he did as white members of the staff, which was radical at the time.
He found himself relying more and more on his translator, Wang Chung, not just as a translator and interpreter, but also as a sort of cultural liaison. So Wang Chung helped Dr. Blue understand the community's resistance to Western medical interventions.
With Wang as his trusted go-between, Blue revised the harsh protocol of his predecessor. He disinfected only targeted houses, not whole streets. He quarantined immediate family alone and limited lockdown to the shortest time possible.
He was somebody who was willing to listen, which was a real skill. He knew he wasn't the smartest. He knew he didn't necessarily have insights that other people did, but he was willing to try everything.
But what Blue discovered was unnerving. In the month of July, 3 Japanese prostitutes working on the edge of Chinatown died. Blue reeled at the thought that the women had had contact with literally dozens of nameless customers. How many were there? Where did they go? Blue was terrified that the disease was poised to explode exponentially, as he admitted to Wyman.
It would not be an easy matter to trace the source of this infection. The Chinese seemed to know a suspicious case and depart like the fleas. Rupert Blue.
On the big map right behind his desk, he starts putting red marks everywhere there's a known plague victim. And that becomes his obsession, to try to prevent more red marks from showing up on his map, but also to try to find some kind of connection between these victims.
For the rest of the summer, Blue patiently continued to explore Chinatown, always on the lookout for more cases. On September 11, 1901, following a tip from Wang Chung, Blue and his men had a rare opportunity. In the basement of a grocery store, they found a 28-year-old man with signs of the plague and took him to the Donghua dispensary for observation.
Well, friends of the patient were about to get him out of Chinatown to avoid the red tape, the inspections, the interventions. But Wang Chung's tip enabled the federal doctors to prevent this evasion.
It was the first time Blue had had the opportunity to examine a living patient. Until now, the Chinese had never trusted the MHS enough to cooperate. Blue was able to isolate the man and question him about his contacts to hopefully learn how the disease was being spread. Thanks to Wang Chung's quiet diligence, Chinatown was starting to open up. Cases that had formerly been hidden or misdiagnosed were coming to light, leading to a wave of 10 more confirmed diagnoses.
I am working like a Trojan, and I trust that my labors will be rewarded. We are still working quietly, avoiding friction with the state or the Chinese. Rupert Blue.
He soon finds more and more victims. He sees living victims. He sees more victims quickly before they can be hidden away. So he starts realizing the scope of the problem.
So Wang Chung played a pivotal role, and for this he took many risks. The state doctors who denied the plague's existence may have tipped Chinatown gangsters that Wang Chung was a collaborator, the traitor to his community.
Not that long after, someone tried to kill him. And he had to run for his life, essentially.
It took the intervention of Washington, and only then was Wang Chung secure to go about his medical rounds with the doctors.
For 18 months, Blue, like Kenyon before him, had been confounded by the low number of fatalities. But neither man had had the full picture. Blue began to realize that white doctors throughout San Francisco, bowing to political pressure, were deliberately misdiagnosing cases in order to minimize actual numbers.
Scant courtesy, singular apathy, and in the end, interference have characterized the State Health Board at a time of grave public peril. Eradication of the disease would be entirely out of the question, and the danger of an indefinite stay is enhanced. Rupert Blue.
By the fall of 1902, the number of officially diagnosed cases had tripled. At the annual meeting of state and local health boards in New Haven, Connecticut, San Francisco was all everyone talked about. California officials continued to deny that the plague existed, in direct contradiction to the MHS and national papers.
Other state boards of health started issuing censure votes and statements of condemnation against the state of California, against Governor Gage, against the denial of plague. And some radicals even demanded that the Navy transfer centers be moved north to Seattle. Well, this was serious. San Francisco did not want to risk such a loss of power. At this point, the denial of plague became costly. California had run out of options. It was time to face it and clean it out and stamp it out.
The responsibility of controlling the plague rested squarely on Blue's shoulders.
Blue's boxing taught him how to bob and weave, size up his opponents, anticipating their next move, put an edge on his strategic approach.
Now, he stared at his map for the 100th time. Every single block in Chinatown had had a confirmed case. But in the previous September, a white washerwoman with no connection to the district had died of plague. And she lived a block away. It dawned on Blue he'd been ignoring something that had been right in front of him the entire time. The mystery of why the plague had decimated Europe and Asia for centuries was finally beginning to unravel.
For us kids, one of the great pastimes was just fishing off the piers, which ran almost right up against Chinatown. And ships that were moored to the docks, they had these huge ropes. You would see rats just coming from the ships and coming down those ropes. And some of them would just fall in the water. Others were able to find their way onto the docks. They scurried, they were fast, and they were quick.
Rats are biological marvels in many ways because they can survive almost anything, and they can breed incredibly quickly.
And a single pair of rats left to reproduce unhampered would become 1,500 in a year.
In his lab, Blue and his men had discovered plague germs in dead rats that they had dissected. He was now struck by the possibility that rats themselves might somehow spread the disease as they roamed the city, though he still had no idea how.
And he realizes the only way we're going to save San Francisco is if we kill as many rats as possible. So they focus on rat eradication.
Thanks to Wang Cheng's prior outreach, the Chinese 6 companies now agreed that all Chinatown businesses would work with health authorities.
People should not be frightened. These physicians are very kind and gentle. Their main emphasis is to go after the rats. 中社一報 daily.
The state was assigned to hire inspectors. The city would lay traps and poison bait for rats. And they tried to get all the citizens involved in rat collection. So they offered 10 cents a rat, even 50 cents for a breeding female. So you can imagine this is quite a sum. And people got involved in bringing in rats.
Blue starts to look for where are rats living. Let's create as few nesting spots for a rat as possible. Wooden sidewalks provide so many places for rats to nest. So he rips those out, and let's have concrete sidewalks. At the same time, let's tear down these remnants of the past, buildings that were still up from Gold Rush era. And let's have more modern buildings in their place.
By the spring of 1905, Chinatown was almost completely renovated. Blue's team was dismantled, its job done, and he was sent to his new posting in Virginia. With no new cases being reported in over a year, as far as everyone was concerned, the plague was finally under control. Out of the official tally of 119 confirmed cases, 104 victims were Asian, and 15 were non-Asian.
I think it's fair to say that the true death toll is probably 10 times as much, if not more.
It was more than likely the accurate number of plague cases were underreported because they were entirely racially focused on Asian people. Just after 5 a.m., April 18th, 1906, the city was racked by a massive earthquake. It would have been 7.9 on the Richter scale, an extremely dangerous earthquake, particularly in a city of unreinforced brick and mortar buildings that simply crumbled. Buildings were pancaked, floors collapsed. The city was ablaze. Water mains were broken, so the water reservoirs were not available to fight fires. In a desperate attempt to stop the advancing flames, the city resorted to setting strategic charges to keep the fire from jumping. That helped a little bit. But some ne'er-do-wells started dynamiting Chinatown indiscriminately, destroying buildings even further.
More than 80% of San Francisco was destroyed, including virtually all of Chinatown.
There were 3,000 people killed outright, nearly 250,000 injured, hundreds of thousands homeless.
And you had refugees who suddenly have to live in places like Golden Gate Park or other makeshift camps.
People were living out of tents. People were living in a village of earthquake cottages built by the Red Cross.
The Army and Red Cross handed out crackers and canned milk. But when word spread that no such aid would be given to the Chinese, the community once again turned to its own devices. Four years earlier, merchant Liu Hing had moved away from San Francisco.
Liu Hing decided to open a cannery in Oakland, away from San Francisco. Having been tired of being harassed by the white media, having had to compete against the white canneries that had formed a cartel to try and drive all the independent canneries out of business, and particularly targeted Liu Hing because he had become such a force in the cannery business. When the earthquake hit on April 18th, the Chinese in San Francisco, they were refused by the white relief agencies and had no place to go. And so many of the Chinese came to a very small Chinese settlement in Oakland, where my great-grandfather, who had some vacant areas around his cannery, he then hired people to cook and was able to feed thousands of the Chinese who came over.
San Francisco was staggering to regain its footing amidst the devastation. And the fallout continued to escalate.
You had instant problems of sanitation. If you didn't die from the earthquake or die from the fire, you might die from diphtheria or smallpox or all these other diseases that could rear their head very quickly.
With the sewer pipes ruptured, rats, including plague-infected ones, were released into the city to feast on the uncollected refuse and breed in the ruins. So once again, there was a resurgence of rats and rat-borne plague.
13 months after the earthquake, San Francisco had its first plague death in 3 years. By summer, there were 6 more. Wyman immediately wired Blue and ordered him to return to San Francisco.
On this otherwise unassuming residential street in a Victorian house, Dr. Blue set up his new headquarters. And from there, he ran his command center.
The problem they find very quickly is that plague is no longer a Chinatown problem, it's a San Francisco problem.
In stark contrast to the early days, there was now only one Chinese casualty, the president of the Chinese 6 companies.
And that's when Blue starts hearing from white physicians who say, perhaps I have seen plague cases before and I just thought it was pneumonia. Or actually maybe I knew it was plague and I didn't want to admit it. And this kind of solidifies for Blue, this was a disease of the environment.
Now, bubonic plague began to emerge in all sorts of different communities across the Bay Area. And people began to realize that anyone could get bubonic plague.
Blue set up a special workplace dedicated to the grisly task at hand.
In back of the federal headquarters was an annex to the building that became known as the Rattery. And the Rattery was essentially a coroner's lab, a forensic lab, just for rats.
That's where all the rat carcasses were brought. And it's just rat after rat that's dissected and opened up and examined for signs of the plague. And they would chart, what percentage of rats are infected.
By the fall, there were 30 new plague deaths. Blue and his men stepped up their campaign, killing more than 13,000 rats a week. Throughout, he kept trying out new ways to determine how the disease was spreading through the city.
They even took it a step further and tried to analyze migratory patterns. They wanted to find out where the rats originated and where they traveled. So they devised a program that came to be nicknamed the Rainbow Rats. And they got a group of healthy, active rats and dyed them red, green, or blue, depending upon what district they were from, and turned them loose. Then they would try to catch them at the other end and find out how they were spreading. And of course, when the raucous local press found out, they just had a field day.
The newspapers mock him for this immediately. It almost sounds like something out of Dr. Seuss. And Blue shrinks very quickly from this public mockery. He's not used to that. But he continues to try.
Then a local case caught Blue's eye.
There was a physician who had perceived a bad smell in his house. The doctor decided he would chop out a hole in the wall and get to the source of this unpleasant odor. And there he found 2 dead rats. And immediately, 2 members of the family got the plague.
As Blue pondered the details of this case, he recalled reading a recent report from the British Plague Commission that confirmed the results of a study completed 10 years earlier.
Pasteur Institute scientist Paul Louis Simon did this experiment. He put 2 rats in cages side by side, separated by a grate. They couldn't touch one another. 1 rat was healthy, 1 rat was sick with the plague. And Simon made the breakthrough observation that when the plague rat died, the fleas jumped to the side of the healthy rat for their next blood meal.
Bubonic plague is transmitted by Yersinia pestis. The flea itself is really the host of Yersinia pestis, and when it seeks a blood meal on its natural host, it regurgitates its bacteria and transmits plague. And it's only when its own host dies, the flea seeks another warm body, a rat, or if a human comes by, they'll jump on. It sense that there's something warm here. I don't care what it is. And then they'll bite, they'll try to feed because it's hungry. So the cause of the transmission between rats and human was the flea.
Blue was thunderstruck by the realization that fleas played the primary role in transmitting the disease. Rats, he now understood, were only agents of the epidemic because of the insects in their fur. And pieces fell into place. The peaks of the outbreak lined up with the flea's active season. The baffling on-again, off-again pattern became crystal clear.
So the bubonic plague bacilla was best conveyed by fleas on rats biting humans. That transmission was the most important thing, so the eradication of rats would be pretty significant.
As the city continued to rebuild, Blue knew that public support for rat extermination was solid. Still, without full buy-in from the entire community, the stream of rats would continue unchecked. It was time for extreme measures.
Rupert Blue, the strategist, understood he needed both a carrot and a stick. So, Fleet Week was approaching, but Blue told the city, if the city isn't a healthful place, I will tell the admiral that it's not safe to land his ships. This was terrible news. It would be like canceling Christmas. To have the Great White Fleet barred from entering San Francisco, and worse yet, diverted to Seattle, the rival city, would have been terrible. So all the city had to take part. In 1908, the first truly grassroots, fully public, multi-sector health campaign was born. Educating the populace on simple things like the right way to dispose of garbage. You have to seal your household and secure it against rats. They also educated greengrocers on the right way to store their wares to keep the city streets clean. And they informed the essential nature of sanitary precautions.
They start putting notices in everybody's mailboxes, like this is what you can do to save yourself and save the city.
And little by little, hundreds and hundreds of citizens from all walks of life, churches, temples, lodges, women's clubs, business groups, everyone got on board and did their part.
San Francisco got to work. Long-neglected sanitary infrastructure was rebuilt. A $4 million bond was issued to renovate the sewer system. And municipal garbage collection and disposal were put in place. By now, even the local newspapers supported the sanitation drive by publishing the names and addresses of anyone who failed to comply. In the end, Blue managed to have more than 20,000 houses inspected. Untold numbers of rats were either trapped or found dead. But of the ones tested, only 16 were found to be infected. The outbreak was in retreat. With backbreaking work and focused messaging, Blue had finally rounded the corner on the disease. The question that had so long tormented Kenyon and Blue, why hadn't the plague taken off exponentially, was at last answered.
It's so interesting that we had the germ that was just as lethal as during the Black Death. The same germ that had ravaged populations in China and India. What may have saved the city in the end from a much worse disaster was a tiny part of an organ inside of the little flea.
In places where you had this explosion of plague, there was a different species of rat flea. Its anatomy was slightly different. It would inject more of the plague bacilli into whatever victim it bit. In San Francisco, the flea bite would inject a lower dose, harder for it to become a full-blown disease. So it was only this quirk of flea anatomy that really prevented millions of deaths in the US.
February 1908 saw the last diagnosed case of bubonic plague. For the first time in nearly 8 years, San Francisco could afford to celebrate. And on May 6, 1908, the Great White Fleet sailed into San Francisco Bay.
People stood atop every hill and promontory to get a look at these magnificent golden and white ships that were sent by Theodore Roosevelt. People were waving flags and partying all week. It celebrated not only the Great White Fleet and naval power, but also the rebirth of San Francisco as a healthful city. And it was an effort in which everyone had taken part.
Chinatown was celebrating its own victory. Its near-total destruction during the earthquake had lured white speculators, eager to snap up the valuable land. But they hadn't counted on the fierce opposition of Chinese merchants and associations, who fought them tooth and nail to control how they wanted the district to be used.
We later learned, of course, they were quite successful in turning the fear of Chinatown as a labyrinth of disease and immorality into a kind of middle-class consumer tourist paradise.
On March 31, 1909, Rupert Blue was honored with a lavish ceremony at the Fairmont Hotel on Nob Hill.
The dinner was rat-themed. They had ice cream molds in the shape of rat traps. They drank wine punch from beakers that were shaped like little trash cans. It was visual puns everywhere.
It was a darkly humorous nod to the rats killed. 2 million in all, roughly 5 times the size of San Francisco's human population.
And when he was called to the dais to accept his gift in the city's thanks, some of Blue's old shyness came flooding back, and he said, "It's difficult to speak when one's heart is full." After all his achievements, he got rather tongue-tied.
It was likely Blue's reticence arose from not just humility, but a clear-eyed view of the debt he owed his predecessor. True, he had been able to clean up San Francisco and rid the city of its rats. But Kenyon was the one who insisted that the problem even existed, and at enormous personal cost.
Blue was seen as a hero, and he continued on an upward trajectory. He became the 4th Surgeon General of the United States. He was a very forward thinker. He was somebody who advocated for better treatment of the mentally ill. He advocated for national health insurance at a time when that was never heard of whatsoever. He saw where the world was going.
Dr. Joseph Kenyon's ouster from San Francisco represented a kind of failure of institutional resistance and rivalries. But he is remembered for bringing state-of-the-art methods of diagnosing infectious diseases to America. He is remembered for helping found the National Hygienic Laboratory, the forerunner of our modern National Institutes of Health, for which he is posthumously recognized as the first director of NIH.
The two men brought an end to the epidemic, using vastly different approaches. Yet it was the efforts of not just Kenyon and Blue, but the marginalized community that still managed to stand up for its rights, that led to a paradigm shift in the way America viewed public health.
One of the things that we learned in San Francisco is that intervention into a disease pandemic is a profoundly political act. Science is one dimension to provide answers and to provide solutions, but it was still subject to human interpretation, human implementation.
The question that came up in 1900 is, what is the balance between public necessity, public health, and individual rights and liberties? And it was balanced in a terrible way.
Power-seeking politicians and misguided commercial greed that takes precedence over public health, all of that delayed a solution in San Francisco. In the end, we needed collaboration and cooperation by the federal, state, and local governments, participation by the citizenry, understanding and acceptance of science.
Science is implicated with the larger society. In San Francisco, we actually pressed science to do work that it has no business doing. You don't need science to tell us that we should treat people with dignity and love. Science is a method of inquiry. It knows a lot, but there's always unknowns.
We had some worldviews that were coming into big conflict about how to think about science, about how to deal with a public health crisis, how to not ascribe a racial cause for the disease, and diverting accountability. But also to think about, is it possible to protect myself from disease? Is it possible to eradicate disease? And those are open questions.
Hello. How about now? Okay, great. Okay, I think I can't solve the video issue, but I'm standing on the stage right now, facing our audience. So I apologize to everybody online. This is unplanned. But anyway, let me introduce our panelists. We're running a little bit behind time, and we're very fortunate to have four of them joining us tonight. Okay, so our first panelist is Dr. Sean Gibbs. He is Dean of Texas A&M University School of Public Health. Dr. Gibbs has over 100 articles in industrial hygiene, focusing on disrupting transmission of high consequence infectious diseases, such as the plague. He is on the board for Global EHS Credentialing and the Texas Health Institute, as well as the NIOSH Board of Scientific Counselors. He was a member of CLIAC Biosafety Working Group, the US EPA Board of Scientific Counselors for Homeland Security and Southeastern Conference, COVID-19 Medical Task Force, the US faculty Fulbright Scholar to Egypt, and principal investigator of 3 Fulbright faculty development programs. At Nebraska Biocontainment Unit, he led and performed aeromedical evacuation, ground transportation and safety, and risk reduction involved in the treatment of confirmed and under investigation patients with Ebola virus disease in Nebraska and the US. His research helped determine national policies, procedure, and best practices for response to Ebola virus disease, COVID-19, and other high consequence infectious diseases. I'm going to go change the display later so that we can get a better view of our panelists. Next is Dr. Nia Lindsay. Dr. Lindsay is the founder and CEO of the Public Health Doctor, a health policy consulting firm dedicated to advancing equity and strengthening public health systems. She also teaches biology and human anatomy and physiology as an adjunct professor at the Community College of Baltimore County. Dr. Lindsay has over 2 decades of experience across federal, state, and corporate health systems. Her career has spanned public health preparedness, biosecurity, and zoonotic infectious disease. Her work has focused on building partnerships and practical solutions to complex health threats, including those at the human-animal-environment interface, just like the plague. She is deeply committed to communicating science in ways that are accessible, inclusive, and empowering for the public, particularly in communities disproportionately impacted by misinformation. Her passion for science communication is grounded in the belief that public understanding of microbiology is essential for collective resilience and informed decision-making. Our third panelist is Jaleese Thomas, who is a research health equity consultant. Jaleese is an attorney by profession. She currently serves as Chief Strategy Officer of Universal Basic Employment, a social venture partner of the United Way of Greater Cleveland, that is launching the nation's first jobs guarantee pilot. She also consults for various health-related nonprofit organizations. Prior to leading strategy for UBE, Jaleese powered research health equity strategy for a department at a top 25 NIH-funded research institution, mobilized research diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility at a U.S. News and World Report Best Regional Hospitals for Equitable Access Hospital System, and facilitated economic and community development opportunities for a community development corporation that connects Cleveland's downtown and innovation districts. Jaleese is interested in helping communicate science matters to the public because she has a firm conviction that it will help ground and improve scientific inquiry, and impact for the future. Apart from work, Jalise is a wife and mom of 3 who enjoys the Cleveland Metro Parks. Our fourth panelist is Dr. Edmund Kubi Appiah. Dr. Appiah is a public health scientist from Drexel University. He specializes in epidemiology and biostatistics. He holds a Bachelor of Dental Surgery degree from the University of Ghana and has extensive clinical experience in both Ghana and in the US. His interests have increasingly focused on infectious disease epidemiology and public health research. He currently contributes to clinical research projects funded by Pfizer and by Cure, using brain imaging to understand obesity-related phenotypes. His academic work reflects a strong commitment to health equity, as seen in his inclusion, diversity, equity, and anti-racism fellowship research, and community health initiatives. Dr. Appiah is passionate about bridging the gap between science and the public. He believes that accessible, accurate information is key to building healthier communities. Outside of academia and research, he enjoys mentoring, playing brass instruments, and supporting local outreach efforts in Philadelphia. All right, so with that introduction, what I want to see is if, oh yeah, okay, finally got this working at least. Hi to our panel. I wanted to see if anyone from the audience might want to start us off with a question. There are microphones located in front of you, and if you need help with those, happy to do so. Perhaps Dave. You, Dave, yeah. Dave, we just have to.
I think I've got it.
Yeah, sounds good.
Couple questions. One for now. At what point did Dr. Kenyon, Joseph Kenyon, receive the recognition for the work that he did instead of all the criticism? When did the public view of him turn around?
Okay, so I'm not sure who on our panel is most familiar with this history. Dr. Kenyon, the question was about Dr. Kenyon. And when did public opinion of this man and his efforts in the 1900 outbreak of plague in San Francisco turn around? So when was he no longer vilified and actually recognized for the work that he did? Anyone would like to take this one? It sounds like we really...
I think, hi everybody, this is Naya. I think when we think of these things, just because we're scientists, we try to think about a specific date and time, but it's not really a specific date and time. It's more of a slow transition where some people still might view him in a negative sense. This outbreak has a lot of parallels to COVID, and we saw some of those same things show up during COVID as well. So I don't know that there's a specific point in time we can name as when someone became less vilified or when more people saw the benefits of public health interventions.
Thank you, Naya. Bye.
Somebody speaking in the room, but I'm not able to hear. I'm not sure about the other speakers.
Yeah. Let me resume my approach.
Fran here in the audience said 2012. So just about 12 years ago. Thank you, Fran, for checking your device.
Yeah, so it seems like around 2012 was when his reputation started to take a turn. But his situation does remind me a lot of the criticisms of Dr. Anthony Fauci, for example. Yeah, with relation to HIV and later to COVID-19. Okay, well, thanks, Dave, for that starter question. Is there anyone else in the audience that would like to go? Or would you like to pose question number 2, Dave?
Curious to know, I guess. My other question, boy, that was that fascinating bit at the end. Apparently, on the morphology of the flea,
Okay.
that was on the rats that made their way to San Francisco, that injected less of that bacteria into the hosts. Do any, well, that's pretty far down in the weeds, perhaps. But can any of the panelists comment on that, on how that was uncovered? And the other thing that was kind of occurring to me is that are there cases of the bubonic plague that apparently are not fatal? Can a person have bubonic plague and not die from it?
Okay.
So 2 questions.
Okay. All right. So I will repeat the questions for our panel in case that was not totally clear. So the question was about the finding at the end of the documentary that the fleas in North America had a minor difference in their anatomy that reduced the dose of plague bacteria that they could deliver to a human during a bite. So Dave was wondering if anyone on the panel could explain more about this and how it was discovered. And his second question, the follow-up question, was whether or not there have been cases where plague victims have survived. So I guess that would be related to the case fatality rate for the plague.
So this is Sean. I can answer the second part of the question, but I cannot answer the first part of the question. So okay. Hopefully someone else is more of a flea expert than I. So first, I'd just like to say hello and thank you for having me, Hood College, and Dave, thank you for being the question asker. We appreciate that. So essentially, when it comes to the second part of the question, yes, people can survive the bubonic plague, particularly nowadays. Essentially, large-scale dosage of modern antibiotics such as gentamicin, ciprofloxacin. Ciprofloxacin's one that's used a lot. Cipro, you'll hear that's the phrase Cipro used. That's used a lot as a large-scale, broad-spectrum antibiotic for the plague, for anthrax, and for a whole host of things. So right now, if it's diagnosed very quickly and the person's relatively healthy, the prognosis is pretty good.
Okay. Thank you, Sean. Yeah, great answer. Like the options for treatment now are way better. So that outbreak happened before the discovery of antibiotics.
And I can address the first question. I'm not a flea expert by any sense, but I believe this particular flea, something with its digestive tract allows it to kind of regurgitate the organism into new hosts so that it spreads the disease more efficiently. I don't believe other fleas have that mechanism, or there's something blocking their regurgitation, so there's less of a transmission of the organism.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Naya.
Dr. Lindsay, I appreciate that. I love a panel where I learn something.
Ditto, likewise.
I have a follow-up flea question.
Another flea question coming up.
So how is it that we have so much travel back and forth via boat of rats from places that have the other kind of flea, and we don't have that flea here? So many other invasive things make that transition so easily. Fleas seem like they propagate a lot. How do we not have them here?
Okay, so the question was about transmission. Why is it that the plague bacteria made it across, but not the fleas that made the Black Death more lethal during the outbreaks in Europe and in Asia, I believe? So the question asker was concerned that fleas, given how quickly they reproduce and how easily they can from one host to another, why is it that we haven't seen those fleas make their way across to North America during this instance and subsequent ones?
I will attempt to address that. You guys are really making me pull back on my veterinary epidemiology, but when you ask that question, I think about invasive species. And so invasive species that are not native to a specific region, they often have difficulty integrating with the local organisms and species. And so they might not, they just might not be viable in this particular in a new territory that they were moved to because they have new predators. But in some situations, invasive species actually dominate because they have no predators. So it just depends on the specific organism and the new environment they're in, whether or not they will proliferate.
All right, and just to add to Dr. Lindsay's submission, so basically, it probably could be like three main points. One, it's like the ecological containment in the wild rodents. Another point is that fleas have very limited long-range mobility. And another point is that we have a better public health surveillance and pest control. So all of these could influence the reason why the spread across North America is sort of reduced in a way. So these are like sort of the three main points I can add. Yeah.
Like the movement of the rats, you know.
Native rats everywhere.
Well, it could be that I think based on what the panelists have said, because there are flea populations here already, those may have outcompeted the fleas that came in with those rats. Yeah. Hard to tell. All right. Wow. Okay. The audience is very lively tonight, so. No fleas in this question.
The role of vaccination in preventing and treating bubonic plague. And my question is, what role does vaccination play today? And what does the panel see going forward, assuming that there is a role for vaccination to prevent plague and other diseases? With the level of vaccine skepticism that we're seeing today, what impact might that have on future episodes of bubonic plague?
Okay.
Highly dangerous conditions.
Okay. So this particular question is focusing on vaccines. The Halfkind vaccine was mentioned. I think that was developed by Mordecai Halfkind. That vaccine against the plague was mentioned during the documentary, but it was not described at length. So the audience member was wondering to what extent plague vaccines are in use today as a means of prevention against the plague. And she's also concerned about the level of vaccine skepticism or the reported level of vaccine skepticism in the news today, and how this might affect the role for vaccines in the prevention of future epidemics.
Hey, Mark, this is Sean. I'd be happy to start us off, and then anyone else who wants to jump in, feel free to cut me off and hop on in. So the first thing is the answer to the first part of that question is vaccines, while available, are not heavily used when it comes to plague prevention. You tend to see it in laboratory workers or in some high-risk situations. But for the most part, you don't see a whole lot of vaccination associated with plague prevention. Most of the time, if someone gets the plague, they're going to go to the treatment option, antibiotics and so on, versus the vaccination option. The second part of that question, I think, is something we're grappling with. I've got a paper that just came out in this month's issue of the American Journal of Public Health, and we're asking that same question around the H5N1 epidemic that's currently sweeping through dairy cattle throughout the country. And one of the things that we're seeing with that is there's not a good chance that if there were a vaccine available that a lot of people would take it. We're going to have a lot of difficulty. We've got, I think everyone here knows, public health across the board. We've got a trust issue that we've got to build out of and build upon. And it's not just with one group, it's with multiple groups. And I think we all know that it's a result of coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic. A lot of people, for various reasons, have lost faith in governmental public health, and we need to help rebuild that faith, rebuild that relationship, and help re-educate and help let people know the benefits of vaccinations. We're seeing that right now. I'm in Texas, and the measles outbreak here is real. And one of the things that keeps bothering me with the measles outbreak is I'm talking to people and they're saying, well, about 1,000 people have been infected with the measles and a couple dozen people have been hospitalized and only 2 people died. And number one, only 2 people died is not a good outcome. But they're also completely negating all the other health outcomes that come along with the measles. Respiratory issues, neurological issues, and so on, that are going to have long-term consequences for these individuals that were vaccine preventable. So that's my thought. I'll open it up to any of the other panelists who want to hop in.
Thanks, Sean. I think that was excellent. And the first word that popped into my head when I heard the question was trustworthiness as well. So, and also being a part of that process. So how are we communicating with people what it's like to be a part of a clinical trial? And if we have greater community participation in clinical trials and you're able to sit at your dinner table or across from a friend and explain what that process is like, I think we would increase the likelihood. I don't think we'll go from 0 to 100 to your point, but we definitely move the needle on that.
I'd also like to add that that point about trust. There are populations that have never trusted the government. So it's not a matter of building trust, it's a matter of integrating these communities into the plans and decisions that we make as public health leaders. Oftentimes we go into a community and we direct the community what to do. We have not asked them what they want. We have not asked them how they feel about it, but we have given orders without considering what their needs are, what their expectations are, or what their view of the entity is that is providing the direction. And I think that's why a lot of public health efforts fail, because they lack community inclusion in the planning process. I also believe that it's not only public health's job to build or rebuild this trust in some cases. That is the job of all people, not only those in the health sector, but government officials, public leaders, now influencers, and many more, because it takes more than public health to integrate a community and to provide public health recommendations and to build trust. Because if we don't have the conversations, no one is going to trust us at all, especially with their lives. And especially now that we're in this social media age where so many talking heads are providing misinformation and just honestly blatant lies. So we have to get in front of it. We have to start speaking up. A lot of times we silo ourselves and we talk to ourselves. We're preaching to the choir, but we really need to engage others that may have differing opinions or that just may not be connected to our public health community.
Dr. Lindsay, I completely agree with what you said. As a matter of fact, I was with the Brazos County Health District. That's our local health district here in College Station. And we were talking about the need for governmental public health to engage in the community, get out there in community before something happens, and to start building that rapport and relationship. And one of the things that's been happening lately is a lot of that, the funding that supported some of those relationships or supported some of that extra time to go out and work with your local church groups or your other organizations, unfortunately doesn't exist anymore. So that's going to be more and more problematic to build that trust when it didn't exist or to rebuild it when it's been lost.
Edmund, would you like to add to that, especially given the fact that you may also be familiar with the situation in Ghana? Maybe that allows you to make some comparisons with the situation we're facing in the US.
Right, thank you. So the rise in vaccine hesitancy sort of even amplified by the misinformation during COVID-19 pandemic actually poses a very serious risk for future outbreaks. Not only for the plague, but there are a lot of diseases like emergent disease like monkeypox, Ebola, which is very common in Africa, and other re-emergent controlled diseases like measles, pertussis, and all of these with these diseases which have been eradicated in a way could sort of re-emerge if we continue to be in this vaccine hesitancy. And even resistance to some emergency use vaccines during outbreaks could also be a problem. So if this trust continue to erode, we have a big problem, honestly. Not only for future plague outbreaks, but even small ones. We could face a very serious public resistance to sort of these controlled public vaccines, especially even if it's administered in a marginalized or a rural community. We are really in a big trouble if we continue to be in this problem of vaccine hesitancy. So it's not only in the northern part of America, but if this misinformation continue to spread across, especially in Africa, it's really going to pose a very big problem. Because most of the information, most of these researches are being done here in the States and even in very developed nations. So if we continue to feed these underdeveloped and developing nations with such misinformation, is really going to pose a very big public health problem worldwide.
Excellent. Thank you very much to the panel. Oh, we have another audience member with a question.
Well, you said you wanted an active audience. So tangentially to that a little bit, I was very struck by the fact that the initial quarantine that they did in the movie of Chinatown alone only lasted 3 days. And the objection was that we can't get our domestic workers, it's bad for the economy. As that went on, you had politicians and newspaper editors and business people who were complaining, well, having a pandemic or an epidemic is bad for business, we can't have that. And I was struck the parallels that we had with the discussions about COVID just a few years ago, that we recognized there were things we should do to protect public health, but yet they had economic impacts that weren't necessarily beneficial. And so that became the great battleground between the parties and between people in our society. We know something's going to come down in the future. It's just a question, not whether if, it's a question of when. So how do you address that as public health officials, particularly interested in the attorney? How do we address that question as a society going forward?
Yeah, thank you so much. I can repeat that question for the panel. Just the question was concerned these various interests that try and insert themselves into the discussion when an infectious disease epidemic like the one we saw in the film is happening. So audience member had noticed the parallels with COVID-19 where you have an infectious disease emerging, but you also have business leaders who are concerned about economic effects if public health measures were to be put in place. So he was particularly interested in asking Jalise to begin to talk about how public health leaders can balance or manage these competing interests when the priority should be bringing the infectious disease outbreak under control.
Thank you for the question. I believe it's about early, continuous collaboration, design thinking, brainstorming, and establishing those relationships before you need them. Because as you said, we already know that we're going to have this again. So without having the cookie cutter available for whatever may be coming our way, if you already have that infrastructure built, you don't have to spend time, precious time, in the middle of the epidemic or pandemic learning about what XYZ's priorities are or what ABC's resources are. So I would really say that. And then I can't overemphasize clear, transparent communication, and then accountability.
Sean, perhaps you would like to add to what Jaleesa started?
So I would say if anyone here can solve this, there's probably a Nobel in your future, or something along those lines. This is the big question of the day right now, and there are no easy answers, particularly when we're seeing the exponential growth in the quality of AI generated materials and its ability to create realistically looking false information. And I think Dr. Thomas said something that I really want to highlight, because a lot of my emergency preparedness colleagues mention it all the time. You don't want to be exchanging business cards during the disaster. And right now, there is not a lot of emphasis on that planning stage for the next infectious disease outbreak or the next disaster. And that's at a local level, a state level, and a national level. If I heard the question being asked, if I heard it correctly, one of the things the person said was, it's not a matter of if, but when this occurs next. And when it occurs next, we're in a weaker position than we were pre-COVID-19. And there's going to be a whole host of people who are, to use Dr. Thomas's comment there, meeting each other for the first time, and that's not good. Additionally, we've seen a lot of retirements and a lot of changeover in governmental public health. So there's been a lot of lack of institutional knowledge that has been lost in this. There's been a lack of community knowledge that's been lost in this. And there's been a lack of long-term relationships a number of long-term relationships that have been lost to this as well. So there is no answer right now. I'm aware of at least 3 doctoral dissertations that are currently being written on these topics, and I'm guessing there's going to be hundreds of more over the next decade or two. So I see Dr. Lindsay has unmuted, so I'll turn it over to her.
In fact, I did my dissertation on this. So this is the challenging part. For most of my early career, I did public health emergency preparedness and response. And this is just a theme, like we should integrate, we should get to know each other before. And unfortunately, this is kind of the crux of public health. When we do our jobs very well, nothing happens, everyone's happy, but no one knows we're working. And then the funding is pulled, the work stops, people stop, there's turnover, not to mention that a lot of the local, and I feel like those are the most important public health jobs, a lot of the local, state, and regional jobs are very low paying. So it's very easy for them to lose staff. And then we get into a situation where we have lower public health surveillance and prevention programs. And then we have another situation. So I would agree that we are going to be, I feel like, in an even more challenging situation now than we were in COVID, just because of AI. This country is deeply divided politically. There is an absolute low level of trust. A lot of the, even our federal leadership in prevention has had turnover. And so this is the perfect situation for a pandemic, actually. Unfortunately, we are not prepared. So I don't want to paint a rosy picture, and excuse my frustration, but it really feels like this is just something, it's a cyclic cycle, this sick cycle that public health is in. And I just think because we are so efficient at doing our jobs in the background, a lot of people don't appreciate the work that we do.
Yeah. Oh, okay. I think we have another question coming from the audience.
To acknowledge how important the work of all of the panelists is, and how much we should be paying attention to you. And we've got 6 people here in the audience. I'm sorry about that. It seems to me that journalism plays an outsized role in shaping public perception. And I'm wondering, since we're now more than 100 years out from the topic that was covered by the documentary, what efforts might be effective in, number one, neutralizing the negative effects of what used to be called yellow journalism, and conversely, making journalism an ally of public health? Is that a possibility? Thank you.
Okay, so the question was about the influence that journalists have in public health situations, and whether or not it might be possible. So if I remember the question correctly, it was about neutralizing the negative effects of misinformation and how to make journalism into an ally of public health. If the panel might have ideas on this. So perhaps, Naya, you've been thinking a lot about misinformation and disinformation. Perhaps you could get us started with this.
Yeah, sure. So I do feel like that's a good road to kind of start down. I think we have to start speaking more, and typically many people in our profession are not very great at speaking, just communicating what they do outside of our small circle. And so, I mean, a lot of my family members don't even really know what I do. Honestly, I have to remind them I'm not a clinical doctor, you know. But I mean, that's something that we can learn from. But I also think that if we maybe thought a little bit more creatively and maybe paired some MPH programs with some journalism programs, because honestly, those are the people that are going to speak the truth. They have the technical expertise. If you just have a journalist and you just have a public health person, they're going to do what they do independently. But if we somehow maybe develop some type of joint degree, that might lead to more clear and accurate voices speaking on public health issues.
Thank you. Edmund, you've been active in the community level in Philadelphia. Would you have any insights as to how you might tackle this particular question, kind of getting the news on your side?
Right. Yeah, I just wanted to add to what Dr. Lindsay said. I think that we sort of can embed journalism in public health response. So, for example, some health departments can now sort of embed public health information officers and sort of a media liaison into outbreak response teams. So this can help enable real-time accurate messaging and shared goals between the media and sort of the health responders. Another thing is that we can also train journalists in health communication. I feel like most of them don't really have, in a way, the health communication is sort of a problem. So just like science communication for researchers, journalism schools and news rooms need training in sort of understanding scientific uncertainty, ethical reporting on sort of some health disparities, and even responsible risk framing. All of these things I feel like could help in a way in this situation.
So I'll hop in here as well. The first thing, Dr. Lindsay, I can sympathize with you. Up until my mother passed, she told people I was a school teacher. So that's one of the issues with being the first in your family to go to college. No matter how many times you try to explain to them what you do, it's still, they still see you as the child. But I think part of it, and this is one of the things that we're doing here at Texas A&M, is we're integrating communication into the MPH curriculum and into the DRPH curriculum so that they can speak to the journalists, but also speak through the journalists to get to that community member and get to those community members at the appropriate level. The other thing is we're seeing items like the conversation and some of the other things that we're doing here with the AP, where we're deliberately constantly trying to push out public health stories that journalists can get, can understand and opportune. Dr. Apaya also started mentioning something that I think is fundamentally very important, which is with the erosion of traditional media, the loss of a lot of people going through those traditional media program, you don't have a lot of journalists who have that scientific, technical writing and understanding ability. Also, with the growth of non-traditional media, you're seeing a lot of people who are putting things out there without the traditional journalist check and balance. So there's kind of this double-edged thing where there's a lot of people just putting absolutely anything out there they want, and the traditional media, because of issues associated with pay and bringing or scaling down, they don't have that technical ability to really get some of that information across and help translate it to the way we need when we have to communicate to various populations.
Yeah. Jalise, would you like to add to that? Given that doing what you do, I imagine that interacting with the news people is quite crucial.
Yeah, absolutely. If I could analogize this to Black maternal health. So back when we were doing some research projects that were academic and community, we reached out to journalists and said, can you highlight this collaborative research project that these people are working on? Can you highlight this event that we're hosting? And it was slowly gaining traction, and it was becoming a part of the normal, natural conversation. And it was super engaging. And maybe I'm being a little biased here, but because I was on the team that was leading it, but still, if we could see more of that approach where it's conversational and just easy to grasp. I mean, simplicity is key here. I think that would be powerful. And I'd just like to add a note too, if anyone's interested, any scientists in the audience or otherwise, in learning how to write op-eds, there's this nonprofit called the Op-Ed Project, and you can apply or pay for to be a part of one of the cohorts, and they'll teach you how to write op-eds. And I'll put the link in the chat for that as well.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Yeah, I think I see some, looking at the comments and the chat window here, Beth O'Malley from Hood is, she's our chaplain, and she's making a good point that traditional media is not where younger generations are viewing, and that we need more public health experts to be doing podcasts and getting into influencer arenas on social media to promote expertise amongst these audiences. So that is a
No, I completely agree with Dr. O'Malley there. And I was talking to someone about this last week. I'm down here at Texas A&M University. We play a little football down here in Texas. So there's been a lot of talk about name, image, and likeness. And I was talking to someone last week. I'm like, we need a name, image, and likeness for a student who's going to be a public health influencer. And we just don't really see those. But that is where this current generation is consuming their information, and it's where more and more people are going to be consuming their information.
Yeah.
I'd like to add too, I came to this realization as well, and just this week I started a social media presence for public health because of just what you said. Most people that I know, even I won't say my age, but it's definitely in the millennial sense. But most people I know, they go to TikTok and they search whatever it is, or YouTube. They are not checking references. They are not looking at any of our traditional information and where we get public health information. Like this is where we need to be. We have to meet people where they are. And as uncomfortable as it is for me to even, be posting and doing all that, someone has to do it. There is an incredible lack of experts out there. And like you said earlier, there are many, many people who are speaking on things that they know nothing about. So we do need to balance the misinformation with knowledgeable, scientific, peer-reviewed information.
Dr. Lindsay, I completely agree with you. And the few organizations that are in those spaces that are on TikTok or doing this, they're putting out things that are so dry that the consumers are just going right over it. So it's got to be a combination of not only accurate but also engaging, and we're lacking the engaging. And I'm just now realizing that when I redid my name, I misspelled my own name. So maybe you don't need to listen to me.
we can. I was like, okay, got to be Gibbs. I've done it before, so.
Could benefit from a Neil deGrasse Tyson here, but yeah, we have another question from Dong in the ASM.
So actually, at the very Chinese, I'm very
Hmm.
and I have three personal comments. First is health health is not only the issue of health health. This topic we see the cultural barrier and the very beginning we see that, especially for quarantine in Chinatown, in San Francisco, and are very interesting to for the quarantine Chinatown, but still allow the routine for continuing people come to back, back and forth. It's not a real quarantine
Yeah.
So I understand that, because it happened the 155 years ago, and nowadays the situation is much better. But still, people need to label specific population, specific racial group, for example, like COVID-19. And about 3 years ago, some people still label COVID-19 as Chinese virus. I believe this is something that is better as Chinese and also as a public health worker, as well as identification. Okay, we might be better. The second question is, we all know from the perspective of global health, there's no boundary or no border for any country. As we know, certainly if there's any outbreak infection in any corner of the world, it can fly over by jet within 24 hours. So that means global health is very important. All countries to work together, to work very well. So I don't think the United States withdraws itself from WHO or it's a smart way. I understand the current application withdraw the country from WHO. The reason why whether it's correct or not correct. Okay. And then the third thing is we all know health health all from the grassroots, from the local level. So health promotion is very important. As the part I would say right now, people talk with Google, so some information is correct, is not correct. So the real health promotion should be, I think, it's very important, at complexity level, community level. So for our health education, I believe we have to, realize that and strengthen the
Okay, so members of the panel, did you guys manage to hear any of that? Not okay.
I did not. I don't know about anyone else.
Okay, I will repeat. And Dong, if I missed something, feel free to add again. So our audience member made 3 comments. His first is related to the incident that we saw in the documentary, where the Chinese in San Francisco was singled out quite unfairly for their purported role in the plague, and in the plague outbreak. And he noted that it was quite ridiculous that the quarantine measures were only applied to the Chinese, the vaccine mandate was only applied to the Chinese, and yet the Caucasian residents of the city were allowed to go about their own business. And he was wondering about how certain populations or subpopulations and communities continue to be marginalized. And he was concerned about the blaming of Asian Americans during COVID-19, the COVID-19 pandemic, where the virus was called various names like the Asian virus, the Chinese virus, or the Kung flu. Those kinds of names come to mind, if I remember. The second comment was about the status of global health, the importance of global health in detecting and controlling infectious disease outbreaks, since these can move by plane quite easily in the present day. And he was concerned about the withdrawal of the US from the WHO and the kind of gap that that introduces in the global health surveillance efforts. The third comment was about community health promotion and how we can continue working on to improve. It has to be done at the grassroots level, but now you have this tremendous interference from the noise on social media and the way that people consume news. So how might we address this kind of grassroots community health promotion? So those were three pretty substantial questions. So perhaps we can start with the first one about stigmatization and exclusion. Would anyone like to jump in on that?
I mean, is there a specific question or just wondering our opinion on the matter?
Dong, did you want to narrow down that question a little bit more?
Yeah. Because from this document, we know all there's an issue working 5 years ago. Because I think there are something wrong there with the cultural barrier to the I cannot say it's relating to this kind of debate because some data specifically against Chinese population. If you work in Chinatown, definitely but you still let the other races to go in and go out, but only living the legend of Chinese is not real population. I understand currently the situation improved much better, but still sometimes, as I mentioned 2 years ago, when we had COVID-19, some people still label COVID-19 virus as Asian virus or Chinese virus. It really make us, at least as an American Chinese, I feel and also label it. But this is my comments. So, but I just want to hear the opinion from the panelists to see what's your perspective on that.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right. Thanks, Tom.
Classes or racist stigmatism of pandemic or disease.
Yeah, okay. So I think Dong had noticed this issue that there's this tendency to stigmatize and blame certain groups of people during an infectious disease outbreak. So there's this kind of otherization. And although the situation has improved considerably since 1900, there are still this attempts to push blame during an outbreak, which may be unfair. For example, with COVID-19, blaming Asian Americans for it because of the idea that the virus originated from China. And he says that he doesn't have a specific question, but he wanted to get a measure of what the panel thinks about these, tendencies to kind of blame certain subpopulations for these infectious disease issues. Yeah.
Unfortunately, that seems to be the pattern of this country. And it's not only restricted to public health issues. A lot of times when there is a problem, I feel like we as a country, we lack accountability. We look for someone to blame or something to blame, no matter what the issue is. It can be health, it can be otherwise. It's happening today. The country tends to pit one group against another group, which is not helpful, instead of collaborating together. And I think that addresses also a question or a comment that was made earlier in terms of global health. Like, we have to collaborate, we have to work together. There is no one to blame. I mean, biology is biology. It's unfortunate. I hope we can get past it. But again, we won't get past it until we We have to do better as a country. And I don't think that's anything that we can take on solely as public health professionals. But I will say we're in a very good position because we interact with a lot of different communities, not only the scientific community, political communities, nonprofits, community-based organizations, faith-based organizations. So we do have the ability to kind of bridge some of those gaps, but I feel like we just have a long way to go. The best thing we can do is to continue to repeat valid, verified information, and to put out our own information that counters that the negative and dividing rhetoric.
Yeah. Thank you,
Right.
Naya.
And just to add to what Dr. Lindsay said, very short and brief. What I've learned as a clinician and as a public health scientist is that we know disease doesn't discriminate. It's just a system in the societies that often do. So it's really, really important that we protect these vulnerable communities, and it will require naming and addressing racism as a public health threat, actually. That's the reason why we are always preaching that public health must go beyond neutrality. It must be anti-racist and must be culturally competent so that we are able to sort of address all of these hate crimes, discrimination against racial and ethnic backgrounds, and all of these. Because these narratives are just perpetuating a false link between race, nationality, and disease, which undermine both public health efforts and community trust. Yeah.
Thank you, Edmund. In fact, may I follow up on that? I have a question actually for Jalise, which is in doing what you do at Universal Basic Employment, have you encountered political vitriol by those who disagree with the idea of universal basic employment?
So, no, it's intended to be a bipartisan solution, and there is no better time than now to be presenting this. Because when we look at the reduction, if not elimination, of social safety net benefits, and this being a potential solution for those who would be able to take part, I find it very difficult to argue against that. I know that there are people who it might be easy to argue against it, but at the end of the day, there's going to be a huge number of people, even greater than what some may think, who are impacted by this pulling out of the rug from underneath feet. And everything that we've seen that you thought was a problem is just going to be exponential, just like what we saw with COVID. That's not when we first learned about health disparities. That's just, to Dr. Apaya's point, that's just when it became important to everyone because it was like, oh, I can't hide from this. So, short answer, no, we have not. But if and when we're ready, because it is intended to be a bipartisan solution, a solution for everyone who's able to take part.
Great. Well, I think, yeah, we've actually had a ton of questions today, and it's been awesome, but we are over time. So I think we are going to thank our panel tonight for an excellent discussion, and I hope everyone enjoyed the film as well. So I guess a round of applause for our panel. Thank you all. Thank you for your time and your expertise. So yeah, I'm recording this. I'm trying to find a way to share the recordings of everybody. I guess for in-person audience, just hang around. We'll have a prize drawing for everyone online. Thank you again for joining us. It's been awesome to see so many of you online, even though in-person attendance is a little bit short. Especially given that it's a summer night and we have our Pride Parade and Pride weekend this weekend. So maybe that's part of the reason why we have fewer people in the audience tonight. But thank you all again. And I bid you all good night and have a great weekend.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Hood College. Enjoy your evening.
Yeah.
Bye.
Okay.